The cold mountain winds of Wyoming Territory whispered through the valley as Harriet Blackwood drew her shawl tighter, watching the first golden rays break over the eastern ridge. Her daily ritual at dawn, fetching water from the well, had become the only constant in her life since her father's passing 3 months ago. She lowered the bucket into the darkness, the rope rough against her calloused hands, and waited with practiced patience for the splash below. Wyoming Territory, 1876. Life had been hard since the end of the Civil War, and harder still for a woman alone. Harriet had managed to keep her small ranch running, but barely. Each day brought new challenges, and this morning, like too many before it, she was bone-tired before the day had properly begun. A sound made her turn. A horse's whinny, followed by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching. Visitors were rare enough to put her on edge, and Harriet's hand instinctively moved to the small pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. The rider appeared from behind the stand of pines, a tall figure silhouetted against the brightening sky. His horse, a magnificent chestnut, slowed as they approached. The stranger's face was obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but there was no mistaking the dust of the trail on his clothes. "Madam," he called, keeping a respectful distance. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." Harriet kept her hand near her weapon. "State your business." He dismounted with fluid grace, movements that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. "Name's Yates Morgan. Been riding 3 days straight from Cheyenne. Was hoping I might trouble you for some water." As he stepped closer, Harriet could see him clearly now, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, a startling blue against his tanned skin, held her gaze steadily. "The well's deep," she said, continuing to wind the rope. "Water's cold this time of year." A smile touched his lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Water's cold, but my fire's warm," he said, gesturing toward a thin plume of smoke rising from beyond the ridge. "I've set up camp just over yonder. You're welcome to share my coffee." "I don't take coffee with strangers, Mr. Morgan," Harriet replied, though something in his easy manner made her less wary than she might have been. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with sun-bleached strands. "Fair enough. Though I'd hoped we might become acquainted. I've been hired to help at the Blackwood Ranch." He paused. "I take it that's you." Harriet stared at him. "Who sent you?" "Marshal Jenkins in Laramie. Said you'd lost your pa and might need a hand with the spring roundup." The bucket reached the surface, water sloshing over the sides. Harriet set it on the stone edge of the well. "Marshal Jenkins should mind his own business." "He seemed to think it was his business, madam. Said your father was a good friend." Harriet sighed. Thomas Jenkins had been one of her father's oldest friends. If he'd sent this cowboy, there was likely good reason. Still, pride made her hesitate. "I manage well enough on my own, Mr. Morgan. I don't doubt it." His eyes moved past her to the ranch house and outbuildings. "But no one should have to face a Wyoming spring alone. Cattle need moving to summer pasture. Fences need mending." He hesitated. "And you look like you could use a night's proper sleep." The observation, though forward, wasn't wrong. Harriet hadn't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since her father died. "I can't pay much," she said finally. "Room, board, and fair wages when you sell the herd is all I ask." He gestured to her bucket. "May I?" When she nodded, he lifted the heavy bucket as if it weighed nothing and began walking toward the house. Harriet watched him for a moment, then followed, wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake or found the solution to her mounting problems. Yates Morgan proved himself useful before the sun had fully risen. After carrying the water to the house, he set about chopping enough firewood to last a week, his powerful strokes making short work of the logs Harriet had been struggling with for days. By mid-morning, He had repaired the broken hinge on the barn door and was assessing the corral fence. Harriet watched him from the kitchen window as she prepared a simple meal. There was something graceful about the way he moved, efficient and purposeful. Not like the drunken cowhands who occasionally pass through looking for work and more often trouble. She called him in for the noon meal: beans, cornbread, and coffee. He washed up at the pump outside, combed his hair with wet fingers, and entered the kitchen with his hat in his hands. "Smells mighty fine, Miss Blackwood." "Harriet," she corrected, setting plates on the table. "If you're to work here, we needn't stand on formality." He nodded, waiting for her to sit before taking his own chair. "Harriet it is, and I'm Yates to my friends." They ate in silence for a few minutes. It had been so long since Harriet had shared a meal with anyone, the experience felt strange. "How many head of cattle are we looking at?" Yates asked, breaking the silence. "About 60. Not much compared to the big outfits, but it's what my father built." 60's a good number for 2 people to manage." He took a sip of coffee. "What's your water situation like for the summer grazing?" "There's a creek running through the north pasture. It's never run dry, even in the worst years." "That's good." He nodded thoughtfully. "And your nearest neighbors?" "The Davidson place is about 5 miles east. They're good people. To the west, it's nearly 15 miles to the Russell Ranch. Isolation can be a blessing and a curse out here." Harriet studied him. "You seem to know ranching. Grew up on one in Colorado. Worked others from Texas to Montana." He set down his cup. "Been a lot of places, but never found one that felt like putting down roots." "And what brings you to Wyoming Territory?" He shrugged. "A man gets tired of drifting after a while. Marshall Jenkins mentioned you needed help, and I needed somewhere to winter over. Thought it might be a good arrangement for us both." There was something he wasn't saying, Harriet thought, but then everyone out here had parts of their past they kept hidden. If the marshal vouched for him, that would have to be enough. "Well, Mr. Morgan Yates, you've certainly proven useful already." She gestured toward the woodpile visible through the window. "I've been meaning to get to that for weeks. Happy to help." He finished the last of his cornbread. "If you don't mind, I'll head out this afternoon and check the herd, get a feel for the land." Harriet nodded. "Take the paint mare in the second stall. She knows the property." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "I appreciate the meal and the trust." After he left, Harriet sat alone at the table for a long while. Trust was something she'd been short on lately. But something about Yates Morgan's straightforward manner and the honest work of his hands made her think that perhaps the marshal had sent her exactly what she needed. As the days stretched into weeks, Harriet found herself settling into a rhythm with Yates that felt almost comfortable. They rose before dawn, sharing a quick breakfast before tackling the day's work. Yates handled the heavier tasks, repairing fences, breaking new horses, and checking on the far-flung cattle, while Harriet managed the house, garden, and closer stock. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch as twilight descended, discussing the work accomplished and what remained to be done. Sometimes they talked of other things, books they had read, places they had seen. Yates had traveled widely and spoke of cities like San Francisco and New Orleans with such vivid detail that Harriet could almost see them. "Have you ever wanted to leave here?" he asked one evening as they watched the stars emerge. "See those places for yourself," Harriet considered the question. "When I was younger, perhaps. I used to dream of going east for schooling. My mother had family in Boston." She smiled at the memory. "But after she died, Father needed me here. And now this is home," Yates finished for her. She nodded. "This land gets in your blood, the openness of it, the way the light changes over the mountains." She glanced at him. "But you understand that, I think." "I do." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. More each day. The spring roundup began in early May. Yates rode out before dawn each morning, returning late, covered in dust but satisfied with the progress. He'd managed to convince 2 young men from a neighboring ranch to help for a few days, and together they gathered the scattered cattle from the winter range. On the 4th day, Harriet rode out with them. She was an accomplished horsewoman, her father had seen to that, and Yates seemed impressed by her skill. "You handle that mare better than most men I've seen handle a trained cutting horse," he commented as they rode side by side, watching the gathered herd. "My father believed a woman should know how to do everything a man could do on a ranch," she replied. "Said you never know when you'll be on your own." A shadow crossed Yates's face. He was right about that, though no one should have to be alone out here. The words hung between them, and Harriet found herself studying his profile against the blue Wyoming sky. In the weeks since his arrival, she'd come to appreciate not just his help but his presence. The ranch house no longer echoed with emptiness when she moved through it. That evening, as they counted the calves and assessed the herd's condition, a spring storm blew in from the mountains. The temperature dropped rapidly, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. "We need to get them to shelter," Yates called over the rising wind. "That stand of cottonwoods by the creek should block the worst of it." Together, they worked to move the cattle, their horses struggling against the mud and driving rain. Harriet's mare stumbled once, nearly sending her into the panicking herd, but she managed to right herself. By the time they had the cattle settled, both were soaked to the skin and shivering. The ride back to the ranch house seemed interminable in the gathering darkness. "You're freezing," Yates said as they finally reached the barn. He helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady around her waist. "We need to get you warm." Inside the house, Harriet changed into dry clothes while Yates built up the fire. When she emerged from her room, he had coffee brewing and had laid out blankets near the hearth. "Drink this," he said, handing her a steaming cup. "It'll warm you from the inside." She accepted gratefully, noticing that he had changed as well, into a clean shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. His hair was still damp, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. "You saved the herd today," she said after a long sip. "I couldn't have managed that alone." He shook his head. "You would have found a way. You're stronger than you know, Harriet Blackwood." Something in his voice made her look up. His eyes, reflecting the firelight, held an intensity that made her breath catch. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." They sat in companionable silence as the storm raged outside, the fire crackling between them. For the first time since her father's death, Harriet felt truly safe. As spring gave way to summer, the work continued unabated. The cattle were moved to higher pastures, the garden flourished under Harriet's care, and Yates seemed to find endless projects to improve the ranch. He reinforced the barn roof, expanded the chicken coop, and even built a new smokehouse that Harriet had been wanting for years. In town, people noticed the changes at the Blackwood place. The general store owner, Mrs. Peterson, commented on it when Harriet came in for supplies. "Your place is looking mighty fine these days," she said, measuring out flour. "That new hand of yours must be working out well." Harriet nodded, hoping her face didn't betray the warmth she felt at the mention of Yates. "He's been a great help." Mrs. Peterson's knowing smile suggested she saw more than Harriet intended to show. "Handsome fellow, too, polite, not like some of these rough types passing through." "He's a good man," Harriet agreed, carefully neutral. "A woman alone needs a good man," Mrs. Peterson continued, wrapping packages. "Especially out here." Harriet changed the subject, but the woman's words stayed with her on the ride home. She had come to rely on Yates in ways that went beyond his help with the ranch. His steady presence, his quiet strength, The way he listened when she spoke these things had become as essential to her as water from the well. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching a summer thunderstorm build over the mountains, Harriet found herself studying him openly. The strong line of his jaw, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow, the way his hands, calloused and capable, rested easily on his knees. He caught her looking and smiled. "Something on your mind?" "I was just thinking," she said carefully, "about how different things are since you arrived. Good different or bad different? Good." She watched the distant lightning illuminate the clouds. "Very good." He seemed about to say something, then thought better of it. Instead, he rose and moved to lean against the porch railing, his back to her. "I should tell you something, Harriet." His voice was different now, hesitant. "About why I came here." She felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. "You said Marshal Jenkins sent you." "He did." Yates turned to face her. "But there's more to it than that. I knew your father." Harriet stared at him. "What? How?" "During the war. We served in the same regiment for a time." He ran a hand through his hair. "He saved my life at Shiloh, carried me off that battlefield when everyone else had given me up for dead." "He never mentioned you," Harriet said, confusion and suspicion warring within her. "We lost touch after the war. I went west, drifting. He came back here to you and your mother." Yates looked at her directly now. "I didn't know he'd passed until I ran into Jenkins in Cheyenne. When he told me about you being here alone, I knew I had to come, to repay the debt." "So you came out of obligation," Harriet said flatly. "Not because you needed work." "At first, yes." He moved closer, kneeling before her chair so they were at eye level. "But Harriet, that changed the moment I saw you at that well. The way you stood your ground, unafraid, determined to make it on your own. I stayed because I wanted to, because I found something here I haven't found anywhere else." The first fat raindrops began to fall, spattering the dusty yard. Harriet felt rooted to her chair, unable to process what he was saying. "Why didn't you tell me this when you arrived? Would you have believed me? A stranger claiming friendship with your father." He shook his head. "I wanted to earn your trust first, to prove myself with actions, not words." The rain was falling steadily now, but neither moved to go inside. Harriet studied his face, looking for deception and finding only open honesty. "Did he suffer at the end?" Yates asked softly. Jenkins didn't know the details. The unexpected question broke something loose in Harriet. For months, she had carried the weight of her father's final days alone, with no one to share the burden. "It was his heart," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. "He went quickly. One moment we were discussing the spring planting, the next." She swallowed hard. "The doctor said he didn't suffer." Yates reached out hesitantly, covering her hand with his own. "He was a good man, your father, the best I've known." "Yes," Harriet whispered. "He was." They sat in silence as the storm moved overhead, thunder rumbling through the mountains. Harriet did not pull her hand away, and Yates did not let go. Later that night, lying in her bed listening to the receding storm, Harriet thought about what Yates had revealed. There was a part of her that felt deceived, but a larger part understood his reasoning. And if she was honest with herself, knowing he had come out of loyalty to her father rather than mere chance made his presence feel more right somehow. As if he belonged here, not just as a hired hand but as a connection to her past and, perhaps, her future. The revelation about Yates's connection to her father changed something between them. There was a new openness in their conversations, as Yates shared stories of the war and her father's bravery that Harriet had never heard. Her father had rarely spoken of those dark years, and hearing about them now, through Yates's eyes, gave her a new appreciation for the man who had raised her. "He talked about you constantly," Yates told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "Carried a daguerreotype of you and your mother." Said getting back to you both was what kept him going through the worst of it. Harriet smiled, picturing her father as a younger man, before grief and hard work had aged him prematurely. He was different after he came back, quieter. Mother said the war changed everyone who fought in it. It did, Yates agreed, his eyes distant. Some more than others. Your father held on to his humanity when many lost theirs. He reminded the rest of us what we were fighting for. As July gave way to August, the days grew hotter and longer. The work was relentless, irrigating the garden, moving cattle to fresh pasture, preparing for the coming winter, but they fell into an easy partnership that made the labor less burdensome. In town, rumors began to circulate about the nature of their arrangement. Harriet heard the whispers when she visited the general store, saw the speculative glances when she and Yates attended church together. It bothered her less than she would have expected. Let them talk. She knew the truth of their situation, or did she? Sometimes, catching Yates looking at her when he thought she wouldn't notice, or feeling the brush of his hand against hers as they worked side by side, Harriet wondered if there was more growing between them than friendship and mutual respect. The question was answered on a scorching August afternoon. They had been mending fences in the north pasture since dawn, working together in companionable silence. The sun beat down mercilessly, and by midday, both were exhausted. "There's a swimming hole just over that rise," Harriet said, wiping sweat from her brow. "My father used to take me there when I was a child." Yates looked at her, then at the shimmering heat waves rising from the prairie. "Sounds like heaven right about now." The swimming hole was fed by a cold spring that bubbled up from deep underground, creating a pool of crystal-clear water surrounded by cottonwoods. The temperature dropped noticeably in the shade of the ancient trees. "It's beautiful," Yates said, dismounting and leading his horse to drink. Harriet slid from her saddle, feeling the familiar sense of peace that always came over her in this place. "It's always been my favorite spot on the ranch." They watered the horses, and then, by unspoken agreement, settled beneath the largest cottonwood for a rest. Harriet unpacked the lunch she had brought: bread, cheese, and dried apple slices, while Yates filled their canteens from the spring. They ate in comfortable silence, watching dragonflies skim across the water's surface. After they finished, Yates leaned back against the tree trunk, closing his eyes. "I could stay here forever," he murmured. "On this spot or on the ranch?" Harriet asked, the question slipping out before she could consider its implications. He opened his eyes, turning to look at her directly. "Both." The simple word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Harriet felt her heart begin to race. "Your contract was just through the summer," she said carefully. "Is that all you want it to be?" Harriet looked away, out over the water. "I don't know what I want." "Yes, you do." His voice was gentle but certain. "You're just afraid to say it." He was right, and the realization both terrified and exhilarated her. In the months since Yates's arrival, he had become essential to her in ways that went far beyond his help with the ranch. "I've been alone a long time," she said finally. "I'm used to relying on myself." "And you think caring for someone means giving that up?" He shifted closer, not touching her but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Harriet, the strength I admire in you isn't diminished by sharing your life. It's multiplied." She turned to face him, studying the earnest blue eyes that had become so familiar. "Is that what you want, to share my life?" "I want to build a life with you," he said simply. "Here on this land your father loved, if you'll have me." The directness of his words took her breath away. There was no artifice in Yates Morgan, no guile or deception. Just honest feeling, openly expressed. Before she could respond, he reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek. "May I?" she nodded, unable to speak. His fingers brushed her skin with infinite gentleness, as if she were made of something precious and fragile. "I've wanted to do that since the first day," he confessed, his voice rough. "When I saw you standing by that well, fierce and beautiful in the dawn light. Why didn't you?" "Because you weren't ready." His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "And because some things are worth waiting for." The kiss, when it came, was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Harriet answered by moving closer, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. The world narrowed to the point where they touched, everything else falling away. When they finally broke apart, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Harriet Blackwood. I think I have since that first morning." The words should have frightened her. Instead, they felt like coming home after a long journey. "I love you too," she whispered, the truth of it washing through her like the clear spring water beside them. They returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, riding side by side in a new awareness of each other. Nothing had changed in the practical sense. There was still work to be done, a ranch to run, but everything had shifted between them. That night, sitting on the porch as they often did, Yates took her hand openly, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "We should talk about what happens next," he said. Harriet nodded. The practical considerations couldn't be ignored, no matter how much she might wish to dwell in the glow of new love. "People will talk," she said. "They already are. Let them." He squeezed her hand. "Unless it bothers you." She considered this. "Not for my sake, but it could affect the ranch, our business dealings. There's a simple solution to that." He turned to face her fully. "Marry me." The directness of the proposal, so typical of Yates, made her laugh despite the seriousness of the moment. "Is that how you ask a woman to be your wife? No bended knee, no pretty speech." A slow smile spread across his face. "Would you prefer that? Because I can do pretty speeches if needed." He slid from his chair to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Harriet Blackwood, you are the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, of building a life and a legacy on this land together?" She felt tears spring to her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "Now you're making fun." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object that gleamed in the fading light. "I've been carrying this for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment." It was a ring, a simple band of gold with a small pearl set in the center. Nothing ostentatious, but beautiful in its simplicity. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The only thing of hers I have left." Harriet stared at the ring, then at Yates's face, open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "Yes," she said, the word coming easily now that the moment was here. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose and pulled her to her feet and into his arms. His kiss was different now, certain, claiming a promise of things to come. When they parted, Harriet rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Your mother would be proud," she said softly. "That you found someone to give her ring to. She would have loved you," he replied, his voice rumbling under her ear. "Almost as much as I do." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in town. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with neighbors and friends filling the pews. Mrs. Peterson cried openly, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed. "To think he came all that way because of a promise to your father," she sniffled to Harriet afterward. "It's like something from a novel." Harriet smiled, catching Yates's eye across the room. There was more to their story than the townsfolk knew, but the essence of it was true enough. A promise had brought him to her well that dawn, but love had kept him there. The wedding celebration continued at the ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwoods and lanterns hanging from the branches. As twilight descended, someone produced a fiddle and impromptu dancing began on the packed earth of the yard. Yates led Harriet into the circle of light, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, the name new and wonderful on his lips. "Mr. Morgan," she replied with a smile that matched his own. They moved together as if they had been dancing all their lives, finding the rhythm of each other as naturally as breathing. Around them, friends and neighbors clapped and called encouragement, but Harriet heard nothing but the music and the sound of Yates's voice as he bent to whisper in her ear. "Happy," she nodded, unable to find words adequate for the fullness in her heart. Later, when the guests had departed and they were alone in the house that was now truly their home, Yates drew her into his arms again. "I've been thinking," he said, his fingers tracing the line of her collarbone, "about what your father would think of all this." Harriet considered the question seriously. "He would be pleased, I think, that I'm not alone, that the ranch will continue, and that it's me." There was a vulnerability in the question that touched her deeply, especially that it's you. She reached up to touch his face. "He respected loyalty above all else, and courage. You have both in abundance." "As do you," he said, drawing her closer. "It takes courage to open your heart after loss, to trust again. You make it easy to be brave," she whispered against his mouth. The kiss that followed sealed their beginning not as employer and hired hand, not as two people brought together by circumstance, but as partners in the truest sense of the word. The first year of their marriage brought changes both expected and surprising. The ranch prospered under their joint care, with Yates implementing improvements that increased their cattle herd and improved the quality of their stock. Harriet expanded the garden and began selling excess produce in town, adding to their income. They established new routines together, finding joy in the shared labor and the quiet evenings by the fire. Yates proved to be a thoughtful husband, attentive to Harriet's needs and respectful of her independence. For her part, Harriet discovered that loving someone didn't mean losing herself, but rather becoming more fully who she was meant to be. Winter arrived with unusual ferocity that year, with snowstorms beginning in early November and continuing through December. The ranch was well prepared, thanks to their diligent work throughout the summer and fall, but the isolation was more complete than Harriet had experienced in previous years. "We might not make it to town until spring thaw," Yates observed one morning in January as they surveyed the snow-covered landscape from the porch. The drifts reached halfway up the corral fence, and the path to the barn had to be shoveled daily. "Does that worry you?" Harriet asked, leaning against his side for warmth. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Not as long as I'm snowed in with you." The winter months passed in a peaceful rhythm of necessary work and quiet evenings. Yates read aloud from the few books they owned while Harriet sewed or mended. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing thoughts and dreams that had never been voiced before. "Have you ever thought about children?" Yates asked one night as they lay in bed, the wind howling outside their snug room. Harriet turned to face him in the darkness. "Yes," she admitted. "More lately than before." He pulled her closer. "I'd like that. A family. This place should have children in it again." The idea took root in Harriet's heart, growing alongside her love for Yates. A child with his blue eyes, perhaps, or his easy laugh. A new generation to inherit the land her father had loved. Spring came late but arrived with exuberant energy, melting the snow rapidly and turning the creek into a rushing torrent. The cattle had weathered the winter well, and the first calves began to appear in April, healthy and strong. As the land renewed itself, Harriet felt changes within her own body. The fatigue that came over her in the afternoons, the unexpected sensitivity to certain foods, and finally, the absence of her monthly cycle. She confirmed her suspicions during their first trip to town after the winter isolation. The doctor, a kind older man who had delivered Harriet herself 24 years earlier, smiled as he gave her the news. "You're about 2 months along, Mrs. Morgan. The baby should arrive in late November, just before the worst of winter." Harriet could barely contain her joy as she rode home, wondering how to share the news with Yates. In the end, the moment presented itself naturally. That evening, as they stood together by the well where they had first met, watching another day end in a blaze of color over the mountains, Harriet took Yates's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We'll need to prepare the small bedroom," she said softly, "for the baby." Yates went still, his eyes widening as he understood. "A baby? You're certain?" she nodded, watching his face transform with wonder. "When?" "November, the doctor thinks." He let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the valley, then lifted her in his arms and spun her around. "A baby, our baby." Setting her down gently, he immediately looked concerned. "Should you be riding? Working so hard? What does the doctor say?" Harriet laughed at his sudden shift from exultation to worry. "He says I should continue as normal for now. Women have been having babies while working ranches since the beginning of time." Yates wasn't entirely convinced, and in the months that followed, he took on more and more of Harriet's tasks, insisting she rest when the summer heat became oppressive. His protectiveness might have chafed if it hadn't been so clearly born of love. As her body changed, growing round with new life, Harriet found herself thinking often of her own mother, who had died when Harriet was just 16. There were questions she wished she could ask, preparations she wasn't sure how to make, but the women of neighboring ranches stepped in, bringing gifts and advice during their infrequent visits. "You'll do fine," Mrs. Davidson assured her during one such visit. "Women are built for this. And that husband of yours would move mountains to keep you safe." It was true. Yates's devotion only deepened as Harriet's pregnancy progressed. He spent evenings talking to her growing belly, telling stories of brave cowboys and beautiful ranchers. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving intricate designs of wildlife and mountains into the headboard. "So the baby will know this land is home," he explained, running his fingers over the smooth wood. As autumn painted the cottonwoods gold and crimson, Harriet felt a growing anticipation. The ranch was ready for winter, with hay stacked high in the barn and the smokehouse full of preserved meat. The root cellar was stocked with vegetables from her garden, and Yates had laid in extra supplies from town coffee, sugar, flour enough to last until spring. "Nothing to do now but wait for our little cowboy," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, his hand resting on the swell of her abdomen. "Or cowgirl," Harriet reminded him with a smile. "Either way, the most beautiful baby in Wyoming Territory." November arrived with unseasonably mild weather, a blessing for which Harriet was grateful. Her due date approached, and though she tried to maintain her normal activities, she found herself tiring easily. "Rest," Yates would urge, guiding her to a chair. "The work will wait." The baby came on a clear, cold morning 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. Harriet woke to the first pains before dawn, recognizing what they meant with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "It's time," she told Yates, who was instantly alert beside her. He dressed quickly, his movements efficient despite his obvious anxiety. "I'll get Mrs. Davidson. She said she would come when the time was near." Harriet nodded, breathing through another contraction. "Be careful. The trails might be icy." He bent to kiss her forehead. "I'll be back before you know it. With help." The hours that followed blurred together for Harriet, pain and waiting, encouragement from Mrs. Davidson, who arrived with Yates by mid-morning, and finally the overwhelming urge to push. Outside the bedroom door, Yates paced like a caged mountain lion, responding instantly when Mrs. Davidson finally called him in. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Harriet, exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up as he entered, her smile brighter than he had ever seen it. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. Yates approached the bed with reverence, sitting carefully beside his wife and child. When Harriet placed the tiny bundle in his arms, his hands so large and capable trembled. "She's perfect," he whispered, studying the small face with its dusting of dark hair and rosebud mouth. "Absolutely perfect. We should name her," Harriet said, leaning against his shoulder to gaze at their daughter. "What about Hope?" Yates suggested. "Because that's what she is. Our hope for the future. Hope Morgan." Harriet tested the name and found it right. "Yes, that's who she is." Mrs. Davidson slipped quietly from the room, leaving the new family to their private joy. Outside, the sun had risen fully, casting golden light through the window and across the bed where they sat. "Thank you," Yates said, his voice thick with emotion. "For her, for everything." Harriet reached up to touch his face, recognizing in his eyes the same overwhelming love she felt. "Thank you for coming to my well that morning." He smiled, remembering. "Water's cold, but my fire's warm," he quoted his own words from that first meeting. "And it's kept me warm ever since," she replied, pulling him down for a gentle kiss over their sleeping daughter. The years that followed brought changes to the Blackwood Morgan Ranch, as Harriet and Yates now called it in honor of both their legacies. Hope grew into a strong, curious child with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination. She was joined 2 years later by a brother, William, named for Harriet's father. The ranch prospered under their joint care. They added land when they could, improved their cattle stock, and built a larger house as their family grew. Yates's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher spread throughout the territory, bringing business opportunities that allowed them to expand further. Harriet found her own role evolving. While she remained deeply involved in the ranch operations, she also became a respected voice in the growing community. When a school was established in the nearby town, she served on its board, ensuring that girls received the same education as boys, something she had always valued. Through it all, their partnership remained the foundation of everything they built. The challenges of ranch life, drought years, harsh winters, the ever-present risk of illness or injury were faced together, with a strength that came from their shared commitment. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Yates surprised Harriet with a special gift. He led her out to the well where they had first met, now enclosed in a small structure to protect it from the elements. "Close your eyes," he instructed, positioning her carefully. When she opened them, she saw what he had done. A simple bronze plaque affixed to the well's stone wall, engraved with the words that had begun their story. "Water's cold, but my fire's warm." "So we never forget how it all started," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Harriet leaned back against him, remembering that dawn so long ago when a dusty cowboy had appeared at her well. "As if I could ever forget." "Sometimes I think about how easily we might have missed each other," Yates mused. "If Jenkins hadn't mentioned you, if I'd taken a different trail." "We wouldn't have," Harriet said with certainty. "Some things are meant to be." He turned her in his arms, studying her face that he knew as well as his own. The years had added a few lines around her eyes, a touch of silver at her temples, but to Yates she was more beautiful than ever. "Still happy, Mrs. Morgan?" he asked, the question both teasing and serious. Harriet thought of their children, sleeping soundly in the house they had built together, of the land that had flourished under their care, of the community they had helped to create, and most of all, of the love that had grown from that first meeting into something enduring and unshakable. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. Above them, the first light of dawn broke over the eastern mountains, just as it had on that fateful morning. Yates and Harriet walked hand in hand back to the house, to the life they had created together, warmed by a fire that would never grow cold.